a beautiful woman. Not knowing she was a river mermaid, by the time they found Onyema's body, his eyes were still wide open, staring at something no living human was meant to see. No bruise, no wound, no struggle, just a single strand of wet, glistening hair on his chest, hair that smelled of river water. Ugomma was nowhere to be found. But none of the villagers knew the full story. None of them knew how love led Onyema into the arms of something evil and patient enough to wait almost a year before showing its true face. It all started the night Onyema realized his wife was not human. A year ago, before Ugomma became Onyema's nightmare, she was his miracle. Onyema was the quiet type. In his late 20s, a palm wine tapper who climbed the tallest trees in Umueze village without fear. He was strong, broad-shouldered from years of carrying heavy gourds, and well-respected among the men who gathered at Mamankechi's stall to drink and argue about village politics. He was the kind of man who believed danger existed only in stories old women told children by firelight. That was before the storm. It happened on a Thursday. The river had overflowed after 3 days of heavy rain, swallowing the old wooden bridge that connected Umueze to the neighbouring village. The water was angry that day, brown and churning, carrying tree branches and debris in its violent current. When Onyema heard the screams, he was returning from the farm with his cutlass still strapped to his waist and his wrapper soaked through from the rain. A crowd had gathered at the riverbank. Women were crying out to the gods. Men were shouting instructions that nobody followed. And in the middle of the raging water, a woman was being dragged downstream, her arms flailing, her head disappearing beneath the surface every few seconds. Onyema didn't think. Later, people would say he was brave. But bravery had nothing to do with it. Something pulled him toward the water, something he couldn't name or resist. His feet moved on their own. He jumped. His friends screamed after him. "Onyema, the river is angry today. You will not survive." But the moment his body hit the water, something strange happened. The current that had been violent and chaotic suddenly felt warm. Not cold, like river water should be after 3 days of rain. It wrapped around him like arms, guiding him, pushing him toward the drowning woman instead of pulling him under. When he reached her, she grabbed onto him with a strength that shocked him. Her fingers dug into his shoulders hard enough to bruise. Her eyes, wide and terrified moments before, were suddenly calm. Too calm. They shone like polished river stones catching sunlight, and for a brief second, Onyema thought he saw something flicker in them, something ancient. But then she coughed, water spilling from her mouth, and the moment passed. He dragged her to the muddy bank. The crowd rushed forward to help, but the moment her feet touched solid ground, people began stepping back. An old fisherman named Ozo made a sign with his fingers, the kind used to ward off evil spirits. A young mother pulled her child behind her skirts. Nobody spoke. The woman coughed again, softer this time, and looked up at Onyema with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "My name is Ugomma," she said, her voice clearer than it should have been for someone who nearly drowned. "You saved me." The crowd had already begun to scatter. People in Umueze didn't like to linger near the river after strange things happened. Too many stories, too many fishermen who went out at dawn and never returned. Too many children who wandered too close to the water and came back different, speaking in languages nobody recognized before they died 3 days later. But Onyema stayed. Something about the way Ugomma looked at him made leaving impossible. She was beautiful. More beautiful than any woman he had ever seen. Her skin was smooth and dark like river clay. Her hair, even soaked and plastered to her skull, seemed to shine with its own light. And when she smiled at him, something in his chest tightened in a way that was both painful and sweet. He wrapped his wrapper around her shivering body. He told himself he was just being kind, that any decent person would do the same. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to examine too closely, he knew it was more than that. He walked her to his small compound at the edge of the village, ignoring the looks from neighbours who watched from their doorways, but said nothing. His mother had died 2 planting seasons ago, so he lived alone in the 3-room mud house his father built before the fever took him. The compound was quiet, except for the chickens scratching in the dirt and the goat tied under the palm tree. He brought Ugomma inside, gave her dry clothes that had belonged to his mother, and told her she could rest. "Just for tonight," he said, though even then he hoped she would stay longer. Ugomma smiled. "Thank you, Onyema. You have a good heart. I will not forget this kindness." What Onyema couldn't know, was that Ugomma had not been drowning. She had been hunting. The river had not tried to kill her. It had delivered her. And she had chosen him long before he jumped into the water. 3 days passed. Then a week. Then 2 weeks. Ugomma was still there, and Onyema found reasons to let her stay. "Just until you find your family," he said, though she never once mentioned looking for them. The truth was, he didn't want her to leave. The compound felt less empty with her there. Food tasted better, sleep came easier. Even his dreams, usually restless and forgettable, became vivid and strange when she was near. Ugomma was perfect, too perfect. She woke before him every morning to start the fire. She cooked jollof rice that made his mouth water from 3 compounds away. When she served him pepper soup, the broth was so rich and flavorful that he found himself scraping the bowl long after it was empty. Other men in the village began to notice. They would stop by his compound with flimsy excuses, a borrowed tool to return, a question about palm wine, just to catch a glimpse of her. And Ugomma would smile at them, polite but distant, before turning her full attention back to Onyema. It made him feel like the most important man in the world. But there were small things, strange things, things that nagged at the back of his mind even as he pushed them away. Every morning, before dawn, Ugomma would wake and leave the compound. She carried a clay pot balanced on her head and walked toward the river. Onyema asked her about it once. "There's a well right here," he said, pointing to the stone well in the center of the compound. "Why walk all the way to the river?" Ugomma just smiled. "River water is cleaner, it tastes better. Don't you want the best for your household?" And the way she said "your household," like they were already bound together, made him forget the question entirely. Then there was the incident with the blood. It happened one evening while Onyema was cutting yam for dinner. The knife slipped. The blade bit into his finger, and blood welled up instantly, bright red against his dark skin. He cursed and reached for a rag, but before he could move, Ugomma was there. She grabbed his hand, her fingers cold despite the heat of the cooking fire, and then, before he could process what was happening, she lifted his finger to her mouth. Her tongue, warm and soft, slid across the wound. She licked the blood slowly, deliberately, her eyes closing as if she were savouring something precious. When she opened her eyes again, she was smiling. "It tastes like you," she whispered. Onyema laughed, uncomfortable but trying to hide it. "You are strange, Ugomma." "I know," she said, still holding his hand, "but you like it." And the terrible thing was, she was right. Despite the unease crawling up his spine, despite the voice in his head telling him something was wrong, he did like it. He liked everything about her. He was falling, fast and helpless, into something he didn't understand. Weeks turned into months. Onyema stopped going to Mama Nkechi's stall as often. He stopped spending evenings with his friends. All he wanted was to be near Ugomma. She consumed his thoughts during the day when he climbed the palm trees. At night, he dreamed of her even when she was sleeping right beside him. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. He had never felt anything like it. He told himself it was love. Deep, overwhelming, once-in-a-lifetime love. But sometimes, late at night when Ugomma was asleep and her breathing was too quiet, too measured, he wondered if love was supposed to feel like drowning. His aunt, Mama Adeze, came to visit on a Saturday afternoon. She was his father's youngest sister, a woman who had delivered half the babies in Umueze and prepared countless bodies for burial. She walked into the compound carrying a basket of yams and smoked fish, her wrapper tied high around her waist, her face set in the no-nonsense expression she wore when she had something important to say. But the moment she stepped through the door of Onyema's house, she stopped. Her entire body went rigid. She sniffed the air once, twice, her nose wrinkling like she had stepped in something rotten. "Onyema," she said slowly, her voice low and careful. "Where did you find this girl?" Ugomma was in the back room, humming softly as she folded clothes. The sound was pretty melodic, but Mama Adeze flinched like she'd been struck. "I pulled her from the river during the flood," Onyema said, feeling defensive, though he didn't know why. "She had nowhere to go." Mama Adeze grabbed his arm and pulled him outside into the harsh afternoon sun. Her grip was strong, her fingers digging into his flesh hard enough to hurt. "Listen to me carefully," she whispered, her eyes darting back to the house. "That woman, her scent is not of this world." "Mama Adeze, please," Onyema said, trying to pull away. "Not this again. She's just a woman." "Just a woman?" Mama Adeze's voice rose. "When was the last time you saw her family? When was the last time she talked about where she came from? Has she ever told you anything real about herself?" Onyema opened his mouth to respond and realized he had no answer. In all the months Ugomma had been living with him, she had never once mentioned her past. No parents, no siblings, no village of origin. It was like she had materialized from nothing the day he pulled her from the water. Mama Adeze saw the realization dawn on his face. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Do you know how many young men have disappeared from this village in the last 10 years? Strong men, healthy men, men who met beautiful women near the river, women with no family, no past, who cooked too well and loved too quickly." Her hands were trembling now. "Those men are gone, Onyema. Their families still burn candles at the shrine because there was nothing left to bury, not even bones." "You're talking nonsense," Onyema said, but his voice lacked conviction. His heart was beating too fast. His palms were sweating. That evening, Ugomma cooked pepper soup. The smell filled the compound, rich and spicy and utterly perfect. She served Mama Adeze first, smiling as she placed the bowl on the mat. "Eat, Mama. You must be hungry after your long walk." Mama Adeze stared at the bowl. She lifted her spoon, brought it close to her lips, and stopped. She sniffed it once, her face going pale. Then she set the spoon down carefully, like she was handling something dangerous. "Your soup is too sweet," she said, her voice steady but cold. "Human hands don't cook like this." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ugomma's smile didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. For just a heartbeat, they flashed silver, bright, reflective, like light catching on water. "You should eat, Mama," Ugomma said softly. "You look so tired. This will give you strength." "I'm fine," Mama Adeze said, standing abruptly. "Onyema, walk me home." "It's getting dark," Ugomma said, standing as well. Her movements were too smooth, too fluid. "Let me walk with you. I know the paths well." "No need," Mama Adeze said quickly. Too quickly. She was already moving toward the door. Ugomma's smile widened. "Safe journey, Mama." The next morning, Mama Adeze didn't wake up. Her children found her in her bed, eyes open and staring at the ceiling, her face frozen in an expression that might have been fear or might have been awe. The village medicine man who prepared her body for burial said her heart had simply stopped. No poison, no illness, just stopped. But he mentioned something strange to Onyema, something he said in passing that lodged itself in Onyema's mind like a thorn. There was water in her ears, the medicine man said, frowning. Clean water, river water. Strange for someone who died in her sleep. The funeral was held 3 days later. The entire village came. They sang the mourning songs. They poured libations. They spoke about how sudden it was, how Mama Adeze had been strong and healthy just yesterday. Onyema stood at the edge of the gathering, numb and hollow, and beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, stood Ugomma. She wore a black wrapper. Her head was bowed respectfully. She looked like any other mourner. But when Onyema glanced at her, just for a second, he thought he saw her lips curve into the smallest smile. That night, lying in bed beside her, he wanted to ask, wanted to demand answers, wanted to scream and accuse and run. But when Ugomma curled against him, her body cool and soft, her breath steady against his neck, the words died in his throat. She whispered, "Your aunt was old, Onyema. These things happen." She was 50, he said, his voice barely audible. Exactly, Ugomma said. Like that explained everything. And then she said something that made his blood turn to ice. Marry me. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a statement, a command wrapped in honey. And Onyema, trapped in something he couldn't see but could feel tightening around him like invisible ropes, heard himself say, yes. The wedding happened 2 weeks later. Ugomma insisted it be small. No dancing, no big celebration, no extended family. Just the village pastor, 2 witnesses, and a ceremony that lasted less than 30 minutes. The whole time, Onyema felt like he was watching himself from a distance. When the pastor told him to repeat his vows, a sudden chill filled the air. It was the middle of dry season, the sun blazing overhead, but everyone shivered. Goosebumps rose on Onyema's arms. The witnesses shifted uncomfortably. Even the pastor stumbled over his words. "You may now live as husband and wife," the pastor said, and Ugomma smiled. Onyema felt like he had just signed his own death warrant. The first month of marriage was normal. Too normal. Ugomma was the perfect wife. She cooked, she cleaned, she never complained, she laughed at his jokes and listened to his stories. At night, she lay beside him, her body cool against his, and whispered things that made him forget every doubt, every fear. He almost convinced himself he had imagined everything. Mama Adeze's death was a coincidence. The strange things were just quirks. He was happy. He was lucky. He had married the most beautiful woman in the village. But then came the first full moon after the wedding. Onyema woke at midnight to the sound of humming, soft and melodic, drifting through the window like smoke. He sat up, his heart already racing, though he didn't know why. Ugomma wasn't beside him. The space where she should have been was cold and damp, the sheets soaked through like someone had poured water on them. The humming grew louder. He followed it outside, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. The compound was bathed in silver moonlight, bright enough to see clearly. And there, in the middle of the yard, stood Ugomma. She was naked, her back to him, water dripping from her hair and running down her spine. But that wasn't what made Onyema's breath catch in his throat. It was the tail, long and serpentine, covered in scales that shimmered blue and green and silver in the moonlight. It moved slowly, deliberately, like a snake, like something alive and separate from her body. And as Onyema watched, frozen in horror and disbelief, Ugomma's skin began to shimmer, not like sweat, like scales, like she was something wearing human skin that was slowly peeling away. She turned. Her eyes were completely silver now. No pupils, no whites, just reflective, glowing silver that caught the moonlight and threw it back. She looked at him, and for the first time since he had pulled her from the river, her smile was not kind. It was hungry. "Onyema," she said, her voice layered, multiple tones speaking at once. "You were not supposed to see this yet." He tried to speak. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His legs refused to move. Terror rooted him to the spot. "You were supposed to love me for 3 full moons," Ugomma continued, taking a step toward him. The tail dragged behind her, leaving a wet trail on the dry ground. "Then I would take you home. My people would welcome you. You would live forever beneath the water, young and strong and mine." She tilted her head, studying him like a predator studies prey. "But you woke up too early. You saw me before the bond was complete, and now..." Water began to rise from the ground, not from a source, not from rain. It just appeared, pooling around Onyema's feet, cold and rising fast. "Please," he managed to whisper. "Ugomma, please." "I loved you," she said. And for just a moment, something almost human flickered in those silver eyes. "In my way, I did. But the river takes what it's owed." The water rose to his ankles, his knees, his waist. He tried to move, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The water was thick, heavy, like hands pulling him down. "I'm sorry," Ugomma whispered, and she almost sounded like she meant it. "But one of us has to return, and it won't be me." The water covered his mouth, his nose, his eyes. He tried to scream, but water rushed into his lungs, cold and merciless. The last thing he saw was Ugomma's face, beautiful and terrible, watching him drown on dry land. By morning, the compound was dry. No puddles, no damp earth, no sign of struggle. Just Onyema's body lying peacefully on the ground, his eyes wide open, staring at something no one else could see. A single strand of long, glistening hair lay across his chest. It smelled like river water. The village elders found him when he didn't come to tap palm wine. They wrapped him in white cloth. They sang the funeral songs. They said his heart must have stopped. They said he was young and healthy, but these things happen. But one old woman, a grandmother who remembered things the young had forgotten, picked up that strand of hair. She sniffed it, and then she looked toward the river, her face grave. "Where is his wife?" she asked. No one knew. Ugomma had vanished. The search parties found nothing. It was as if she had never existed at all. But the fishermen knew better. On nights when the moon was full and the water was calm, they saw a woman standing at the river's edge, beautiful, patient, waiting for the next man brave enough or foolish enough to try to save her.